Welcome, everyone, to the Nerd Journey Podcast, bonus episode number 10. We're joining you every week to talk IT career progression and bring you the advice we wish we'd been given earlier in our careers. I'm your host, John White, at BJourneyman on Twitter, joined by my co-host, Nick Cordy, at NetworkNerd_. Hey, Nick, how's it going?
Hey, John, I'm excited. Bonus episodes, you just never know what we're going to do. I like it. We are both pre-sales technical engineers with backgrounds in IT operations. We hope our career discussions will be vendor neutral, relevant across disciplines, and remain timeless. If you're enjoying our content, please drop us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you subscribe. And if you want to get in touch with us, tweet or DM at Nerd Journey. Ultimately, we're just two nerds on a journey.
A journey to virtual enlightenment.
So let's take a trip, John.
Great. Hey, so this is a bonus episode because we were all set to release something that we recorded a little bit earlier on, an interview, which we will release later on in about a week. And it just seemed wrong to not talk about the kind of upheaval that the U.S. is going through. So we wanted to take an episode about having, this stuff going on, COVID, protests in the streets and talk about that. So I think that really what we wanted to do was kind of frame it as, how do you support colleagues of color in a situation like this? It's not all the time that there's protests and, people being killed by police, but, at the same time, maybe this underlines, a situation where maybe we need to be a little bit more understanding of the struggles that our colleagues of color are going through. I mean, I don't think I've said this explicitly on the podcast before, but, I'm of African-American descent, and my dad was Black and my mother is Japanese. So I feel like I represent, the two of the ethnicities in the past that America has wronged, right? Bringing African slaves over, and then the Japanese population was the one of the last populations that we lawfully removed freedom and property from during World War II. So in that context, I think we wanted to bring you an episode where we had and maybe modeled a difficult conversation. How to support your colleagues, regardless of their ethnicity, but, maybe very specifically if they are of African descent and, might or might not be having problems. So in that spirit, I think we wanted to cover a couple things, a quick conversation about do's and don'ts when it comes to, having difficult conversations with African-American colleagues about, current problems and maybe problems in general. And then, a couple difficult things to talk about when it comes to context, maybe things that you might or might not be aware of that your colleagues might be thinking about in the context that they live in when they live in America. And unless you are, from that background, maybe these things don't necessarily hit you the same way. And maybe you just, aren't aware of them. So, that's worth addressing as well. A couple things that, I've used as a coping mechanism. My main coping mechanism is, pointed sarcasm and intellectualization of things, right? So there's a couple things that I heard in the past week or so. A Malcolm Gladwell special podcast episode that I thought was really interesting, and then another one about police training that I thought would be pretty interesting to drop in. So I think with that kind of as the framework, if that sounds good to you, Nick, maybe we can dive right into it.
Yeah, and if I may, John, I think that from my perspective, I'm a Caucasian dude. So as we talked about before the show, it's hard for me to start up a conversation about this stuff with someone like yourself, because what I don't want to do is I don't want to offend you or anyone else by just bringing it up. I don't want to be the guy that picks the scab. So a lot of this is, it's going to be uncomfortable for both of us, but I think it's going to make us better, and hopefully it makes our listeners better.
Yeah. I think that maybe that leads to like the first like important point of context um, for having relationships with your colleagues, right? Which is, in order to do the work of actually supporting people, you need to kind of invest in a relationship ahead of time. So I think, one of the things that we talked about off mic was, both of us have lost a parent in the past couple years. But we were able to actually have difficult conversations after that, kind of sudden losses, one on one. And, but it was really predicated on us having that like relationship ahead of time, right? And investing in that relationship. And that was it, we both knew like it's difficult, but hey, we're here for each other, and, we've invested in that relationship kind of, medium to long term. So it wasn't just out of the blue, right? It wasn't just like, hey, we've met a couple times and now I just want to let you know that if you want to talk to me about losing your parent, like I'm here. It's like, oh, okay. This is a strange conversation.
Sure. Well, and I think that sometimes we forget when we're so busy at work that the person who comes to work, they have to do a particular job, but when they come to work, they bring a whole unique perspective based on their environment that they've grown up in, the people they've been around and interacted with, the things that have happened to them, good and bad. So all that comes with a person into the workplace, and it affects, how they behave, what they're struggling with, and maybe some things we need to be more cognizant of as we interact with those folks. Kind of like you said with the parent that's passed, you want to show empathy, but you don't want that person to feel like you're treating them different because of that. Or that's my thought anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. You want to, have invested in that relationship, and then B, like give like that permission to say, and I hope you do look upon me as a resource. And, if not, that's fine. I don't need to be here. Like that's not what's important to me. What's important to me is that you have support. And if I can help with that, then I'm happy to. Right.
Yes,
So
sir.
that kind of is the way I think that we want to model that. Right. So let's start with the don'ts. I think a brief way to talk about this is like what you don't want to do is add to the burden. Right. So you shouldn't ask for explanations of things that you don't understand. Um, if you don't understand why peaceful protests turn violent, like maybe your African American colleagues aren't the ones that you should ask. Maybe there's research that you can do independently of them and not force them to contend with the situation as it is, but then also have to explain a bunch of context to you. Hopefully, I can later on explain some of that context, and that'll be useful. But if you're asking them to do additional emotional work, and that's the second point. If you ask them to support you and your stress, like that's also another don't, right? Like, I'm so upset, Nick, like about all these things that I've been seeing, and Nick, I just I hope, like, I assume that you feel bad just as I do, and man, like, what can we do? Like, that you're asking that person to support you in your time of stress instead of offering your support, and not offload your emotional stress onto that person to deal with on top of whatever they may or may not be dealing with. So I think that's another don't.
Sure. And it's okay if you have emotional stress. You probably should, right? No matter who you are over the things that are happening. And like John said, you don't want to put that on someone else.
Yeah, exactly. And then I think the final don't is don't wait to be an ally, right? So don't wait for that person to ask you for support in order to show that you're an ally. And what I mean by that is not like ride in and be like a white knight for people. I just think that, like, racism, structural racism, and implicit racism and bias exist in unconscious bias exist, everywhere. We all have unconscious biases, and you know, sometimes we have conscious biases, right? And when someone unconsciously or consciously exposes that to you, like, I think it's important to call that person out. That's part of being an ally, right? So somebody, says something that, implicitly puts something on, people of other races or other genders, like, you know, it's important to immediately call that out and say, hey, maybe you're joking, I assume you are, but, that doesn't feel okay to me. So maybe if we're joking, we can joke about something else. Or, that's kind of like my deflection, and hopefully not exactly the script that I used, because that felt a little bit awkward to say, but it doesn't matter. Like, the person who's made it awkward is the person who's exposed their bias. And you are the one who has to contend with it. Right. So again, the person who made it awkward is the other person, not you.
Right. And it may feel awkward to say something to that person, but it's kind of like you're seeing someone be bullied and not really doing anything about it because you didn't say something.
Right. I think the analogy that I use for myself is, if someone is making a comment about women in technology, as like a negative or something, or I don't even know how somebody would phrase that to me, but like, I've been pretty vigilant about being ready to say, no, I don't understand. Like, no, like, I have a lot of female colleagues that are amazing and, you know, outstanding. So I don't know what it is that you mean, or, like, whatever response it would be to whatever they say. Um, and just leave it at that. Like, maybe you'll have to explain what it is that you mean. And again, the other person has made it awkward. You are, living in the awkwardness that they have created. So, uh, like that, what can you do except to, softly confront that, or strongly, or, if it keeps on happening, you have to escalate to, whatever appropriate levels, that happens to be,
Yeah, yeah, and I think this kind of plays into the crucial conversations mentality. They talk about
Mm,
creating safety in the conversations. Once something like that happens, it's not really safe for everybody involved, right? Because we've tossed something out there that is going we are pretty sure has offended someone, even if
mhm.
they haven't said something about it. So we can help provide the safety by saying, hey, that's not okay. You may not say it
Right.
exactly like that, but
Hmm.
you can say something.
Yeah, absolutely. And we have to be ready to receive that critique too. If we have an unconscious bias and somebody calls us on it, we have to be willing to sit with it and say, yeah, I'm really going to have to examine that. And I appreciate the feedback, right? I appreciate the constructive feedback and, exposure. Like, maybe I have been joking about that and I shouldn't be, you know. Um, and then be willing to actually, sit and do self-reflection, which is, by the way, very difficult to say, maybe I've been wrong about this all along, um, but important for growth. So with that in mind, let's talk about a couple do's. Right. Do offer support. That's okay. And it can be awkward, right? But that's okay too, and it can be difficult to do, and that's okay. um, so if it's somebody that you work with and you have, however cordial a relationship, I think it's worth saying, hey, um, this message, by the way, doesn't require a response. I just want you to know that, in these times, with everything going on, I want you to know that I'm here as a point of support for you. So if you ever need my support or a person to talk to, I'm here. But it is absolutely unnecessary for you to respond to this, in an email or text or whatever, or even in a conversation. Hey, we don't need to continue to have this conversation. I just want you to know that with everything going on, if you need somebody to talk to, I'm here for you. That being said, we don't need to talk about it anymore right now. Right. And, along a similar vein, offer allyship, and whatever ability or form that you have to be an ally. Like most large organizations have employee resource groups, and they generally have like a specific way for you to engage with that employee resource group as an ally. You know, usually they're not exclusive. I think it's actually maybe even illegal for them to be exclusive, right? To whatever group that they, represent. But, in order to make it a safe space for, that group, figure out how it is that, they engage with allies and go to learn, right? If you are engaging with a group and you want to be an ally, you have to learn and be willing to do the work to become an ally. So
One thing I wanted to ask, John, is
mhm.
when I think about these do's and don'ts, I think they're fantastic. But I'm wondering about the manager-employee relationship.
Mm,
If one of them, in this case, is on the side of someone of color, right now,
mhm.
and the other is not, is it more challenging to have this kind of conversation, or more dicey to bring it up if you're the manager or if you're the employee? What do you think? I don't know.
Yeah, I totally understand what you're saying, because if you are in a peer relationship, then there's no power dynamic, right? There's no implicit role power dynamic. Um, you know, Maybe there's a seniority mismatch, even if you have the same title or whatever, but, you know, more explicitly, one person doesn't have like hiring or firing decision over the other. When you're a manager, I think, implicit in being a manager is that you have to build rapport with your reports, to be able to handle these issues regardless of what they are. If they happen to be issues about race, if they happen to be issues about gender, ethnicity, age, sexuality, mental health status, all of those things, you have to create a safe space for your report to come talk to you about it. I mean, that is like critically important as part of being a manager. So, you know, I would say, parental status, that's another one, that is often missed. That can be hugely stressful. I think as all of us have come to figure out during the age of COVID, um, I think that one was probably hidden from some of us until we were on video calls with everybody in their homes. But yeah, not to get hung up on that, but that it's so yes, it is more difficult, but I also think that as a manager, the manager has more training to engage with reports about and be a source of support on every difficult topic, right? So if the manager in general is not a source of support for all these other things, like if you're having problems with work, don't come to me, like, because I'm not going to support you. I'm going to hold you accountable. Like if that's the kind of manager you are, then you have a problem. You're starting from behind and you have to make up all that ground for everything, because it can't be that you're a source of support for this one thing, but for everything else, you're just a point of accountability. You have to be, I mean, obviously you have to be a point of accountability, but you have to be a source of support as well. Right. And if you're not doing that, then, nothing else is, you almost can't catch up. Right. So,
Sure.
hopefully as a manager, you're doing that work.
That kind of reminds me, and hopefully this isn't reaching too much, but it reminds me of something I read in Fierce Conversations recently.
Mm-hmm.
And the lady who wrote it, I forget her name already, she told a story about a board meeting or some kind of meeting where this lady was giving a presentation, and she noticed that one of her employees rolled his eyes, yawned, seemed very disengaged. And she kind of made the assumption that he was doing this because he didn't think the speaker was competent or didn't like her ideas. And she was proven very wrong when she interrogated reality, because he had had a rough night. His kids were up late. He was just exhausted, out on his feet. Thought this lady had great ideas, didn't realize that he may have offended her. So
Mm-hmm.
the takeaway there was seek to understand what reality is from everyone's perspective.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think one of the things that we think is that if we have any skills at reading body language, we assume that we're masters of it, right? And body language is very, very easy to misread. All right.
Yeah, like that fake smile on your face right now, John.
You're reading it so wrong, Nick.
Yeah,
So
I don't
wrong.
think I am. It's not the coffee either.
Yeah, if you'd had a regular coffee instead of decaf, you'd be able to understand what it is that I'm thinking right now.
Yeah, shame on me. That'll teach you to drink cold brew.
Uh-huh. It was the one time, Nick. It was the one time. I gotta tell you, it was delicious. You're missing out.
Hashtag soapbox.
Okay. So back on topic. The next section, it's difficult for me to dive into context that maybe your African American colleagues are living in that you don't have, because it's difficult to articulate a whole bunch of things without coming off as preachy, and that is not my goal, or accusatory. Like, that's not my goal either. Um, what I'm trying to do is give you context into the thinking that an African American colleague might be having. I'm not saying this is in everybody's mind, um, about history and how they live in the America that they live in, which might be a slightly different America than you live in. And so, again, I hope that it doesn't come off as accusatory and doesn't come off as preachy. Hopefully, it's just informational. I'm also trying to give resources in the form of links and titles of books and things like that. If you want to dive further in, and I think if one of the things that you want to do is be an ally, then maybe I the you shouldn't like go and read every single book that I'm rattling off here. Maybe just investigate like what they're about, or read a summary, and then kind of pursue the things as they come up and educate yourself. Because I certainly haven't read every single book I'm about to rattle off here. And hopefully I'm not going to just rattle off a bunch of books either.
But he does have a lot of good book recommendations for any occasion.
Hey, you signed up for Nerd Journey in your feed, like, you're going to get book recommendations.
For sure.
All right. So contextually, right? So people are frustrated. Like, I don't think, I need to say that. Maybe, like, if you're an African American and you've witnessed, like, hopefully all of us in America, like, have watched this video of somebody being killed by a police officer, slowly crushed, or strangled or asphyxiated to death over the course of 8 or 9 minutes. Like, it's really difficult to watch, and it's really frustrating and it's outrageous. But I think that maybe if you're African American, like, this is like the reality that we kind of live with every day. I'm a Black man, and like my reality is like, my father sat down and had the talk with me. We call it, actually, capital T, the talk, which is, this is how you need to act around police officers in order to not get killed. Right. But, now we've kind of found out, like, you can act that way and you still might end up dead. The context of this is, currently, this is something that's already happened, right? It's happened already, even in Minneapolis, right? 5 years ago, I think it was Philando Castile was shot in his car during a police stop, And I think what happened back then was he had a concealed carry permit. Um, One of the things that happens when you are stopped by a police officer is that you have to inform them that you have a concealed carry permit and that you are currently carrying. It's kind of part of the responsibility of having that concealed carry permit, which is what happened. And then the police officer just drew and shot him. And I think the only reason that we kind of know about it is that his partner recorded what happened afterwards, like on her phone. She pulled out her phone, started recording, and contemporaneously said exactly what happened. This police officer stopped us. Lando said, "This is I'm carrying. I have a legitimate concealed carry," and then he just shot him. Just shot him. And it's upsetting, but that happened 5 years ago, and that was around the same time that I think Michael Brown got uh, killed in Ferguson, and I think it's something that's happening all the time. Like, it hasn't stopped happening. So it's outrageous, but it's also like a fatigue that you end up having. Like, oh, this is happening again, and people outraged again, and we even have protests again. And even unrest in the streets again, which happened 5 years ago. But nothing, like, there's the cynical part of one's brain is like, nothing's going to change again. What? Why? Somebody pointed out to me today, actually, the one thing that's different right now is that maybe there's a captive audience, right? Maybe we're mostly isolated because of COVID-19, so we can't really do much else. A lot of things are shut down. So, part of that context is also COVID-19, right? It came and it kind of interrupted this economic recovery, which at the tail end of the economic recovery was starting to actually help African American communities. They were, the last to participate in the economic recovery after 2007, 2008. And then, immediately hit hard. And then, COVID-19 is disproportionately affecting Black communities. And part of the reason why that is that, there's the, African Americans who do still have a job, tend to have service jobs, and they tend to be tagged as essential. But at the same time, a large percentage of those don't actually have paid time off, paid sick leave, and or health coverage, right? So, that's frustrating. Additional context. I think historically, the prison system, what's always in our minds is the African Americans are disproportionately, um, more likely to go to jail or to prison, and it's a prison system that's run largely for profit, and there's entrenched interests who want to keep it that way and keep sentencing the way it is, so that it's punitive and people go to prison rather than be rehabilitated or even have fair sentencing. And so I have some resources that people can maybe check out. There's a Netflix documentary actually called 13th, and that's a reference to the 13th Amendment. Right now, you don't even need to be a Netflix subscriber to watch the documentary. I think it's on YouTube completely for free. And it's not a pirated version. It's actually put on YouTube by Netflix and made available for free. So something that we'll have a link for that in the show notes. There's also a really good book called The New Jim Crow, which is about this. And it's, obviously a reference to, the segregated South, and how, as segregation was undone, the criminalization of being alive while Black was kind of put into law. So if that's something that you are unaware of, or you feel the need to investigate, then feel moved to investigate, then those are two resources to maybe check out. Um, Nick, again, I want you to kind of interrupt me and ask hard questions if those pop into your mind. Like, I don't want to just I don't want to rattle off a bunch of stuff and feel preachy at the same time. So,
I did not realize the fact that COVID-19 disproportionately affected Black communities. That was news to me.
hmm, yeah,
Some of this stuff I did not know about. Whether
hmm,
that's good or bad, I just didn't know.
it just is, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So the stat on that comes from the CDC, by the way, and we'll include the source for that in the show notes. Um, so the next thing I want to talk about is the problem with uh, the how we talk about um, violence and looting as being the problem. So a lot of news coverage of nonviolent protests will talk about nonviolent protests, which were then, shattered by violence and looting. Um, that that's a real like problematic construction of how we think about protest in this country. Protest in this country has always, even if it was nonviolent, almost always been opposed. So, you know, we now think about in our retrospective view of history, we kind of view the nonviolent protest of Martin Luther King Jr. and his contemporaries as being heroic. At the time, it was not welcomed. It was criminalized, and people went to jail for it, over and over and over again. And people were beaten and put in harm's way, like put in the hospital over and over and over again, um, based on that protest. Nonviolent protest is not welcomed. So I feel like when and maybe this isn't everybody, but I think my eyes have been open to this construction. It's like if only these protests were nonviolent. I think the most recent example of nonviolent protest we have was Colin Kaepernick and some other NFL players who would kneel during the Pledge of Allegiance. Sorry, not the Pledge of Allegiance, the national anthem. And the express purpose of that was um, silent, respectful protest over police brutality, right? And contemporaneously, there was huge opposition to it, and there probably still is. In fact, I think it was Drew Brees, the NFL quarterback, was recently asked about it, and he said, like, I'll never agree with anybody disrespecting the flag. Like, still today, you know, in light of, I think, in the context of being asked about, nonviolent protest to police brutality, like the immediate construct of kneeling during the game was disrespect for the flag and disrespect for the military. But that construct is really strange, right? Um, it almost feels like an intentional misunderstanding of what's going on. So if the person tells you what it is that they're protesting and why they're doing it, it feels strange to then say, oh, but it's disrespectful to this other thing that's completely unrelated. And it's not acceptable. Why don't you just find some other place and time? So again, I think just the reason I'm talking about this is this idea that, like, oh, if only protests were nonviolent, they would be welcome. I think that's a fallacy, right? And I think that Drew Brees like faced some backlash and responded well. Like, I think he immediately released some statements saying he had learned a lot and spoke to people and had his mind changed, and spoke out on it. Like, the cynical part of my mind says, like, he has like a really good crisis PR person. I have no idea. I don't know the person, right? I don't know what's going on in his heart, but I do know like what came out like immediately. And I suspect that a lot of other people feel that way, right? It's like, oh, if you're kneeling during the national anthem, that has something to do with the military and the flag. Like, and that is more important like showing respect for the military and the flag is more important than whatever it is that you have to say. What is it that you're saying again? Oh, that's right. People being killed in the street by the police. I mean, as important as that might be, like kneeling is not the right way to talk about that
And
for some reason.
maybe, John, is it more that we are quicker to be offended with what we think they mean instead of asking what they actually meant?
That's difficult for me to accept, right? Because until, I don't know, 48 hours ago, Drew Brees still considered kneeling during the national anthem to be about disrespecting the flag and the military. Like, and how does somebody come to that opinion? Like, I mean, after 5 years, how like it's intentional? How is it not intentional? I don't know. Is it just like defensively believing that so one doesn't have to actually face the issue that the person is protesting? I mean, I suppose that's possible. Like, the thing that you're protesting is so painful that I'd rather not address it at all and deflect it by this other defensive means. That's possible. Or
okay.
Or just like core racism, right? Like I don't like seeing African Americans with opinions. That's another possibility. So I don't know.
Could be.
Pick your poison. I don't know that. Some of those constructs are worse than others. There's no getting around that. But and I don't pretend to know every construct or every way that somebody can come to that conclusion. But like Drew Brees said, he had grandfathers that served in the military, and so every form of protest during a national anthem like made him immediately think of that. And to the point, I think what he was saying was to the point where he couldn't listen to what Colin Kaepernick was saying. Like it just overrode everything. I mean, I guess that's possible. Again, I don't know the man. I don't know his heart.
Well, I think what I was speaking to is more the like people in general is the problem. Is a generalization of the problem more that we tend to act on what offended us so fast that we didn't actually stop to see what the intentions were behind the action that we made, that we got offended about. Does that make sense?
I suppose that's possible. Yeah. I don't know how that survives years.
I don't know.
Yeah. But then, if we react a certain way and we express it a certain way, then it's difficult to back off from that, right? Because then at that point, you're admitting that you were wrong about it, which is very, very difficult to do. Sure. Unless you're kind of in a space where you're saying, where you have practice at that, of saying, oh, I had this view. It was based on misunderstandings and mistaken facts, and now I'm going to change that view. And most of us aren't actually comfortable with that. Like when we're faced with like facts, we retrench, right? Like we get more entrenched in our opinion, like because we'd rather not change.
Sure.
It's
we haven't motivated the elephant, even though we've directed the rider. Right?
Exactly. So just on this, topic of police brutality, I think there's like a very difficult montage to watch of police brutality at protests against police brutality in the last week, and we'll put the link up to it. It's embedded in a show called Some More News, I think, and which I found very helpful. It was a long episode, but we'll include the direct link to the 4 or 5 minutes of video which was like, unfortunately, like I said, very difficult to watch. And part of it that was really frustrating was that there was like 3 or 4 different videos of police brutality playing all at the same time for 4 minutes, 5 minutes, like kind of one after the other, after the other, after the other, like 3 or 4 at a time, which is, made me think that like there's so much of it going on that, you could put an hour video montage of police brutality, in the past week that of, targeted at peaceful protesters. I think that's like another part of the difficult, going back to the construct of like, peaceful protest is okay, but violence and looting is not. I think that there's actually very little violent protest that's going on. I don't know that I haven't seen much. It depends, I suppose, on how you define violence, but certainly violence against things or property. But I actually haven't seen like protesters surrounding somebody and beating them. I've seen a lot of video of police doing that. So when you talk about violent protest or rioting, if by definition police can't riot, then I suppose like I haven't seen any violent rioting. But it seems like there's a lot of police on citizen violence going on. And so, violent protests, there are protests and then violence being visited upon the protesters by police and law enforcement. And like, that's a problem. Hopefully for everybody. Another construct that is problematic is the phrase, when the looting starts, the shooting starts. I think the President of the United States said that. We'll include a link to the origin of that phrase, which was in the segregationist South. And it was stated by a racist police chief as instructions for his officers. If there are looters, then you should shoot them, right? Was the very clear message. So when the President of the United States says that, it feels like a dog whistle, right? It feels like a clear signal that, a call to violence of, executing people who are, protesting in the streets. That is like the penalty for destruction of property should be death, which feels strange. Without due process of law. That feels strange in America. I think the statement that he made afterwards was, "Oh, I didn't know the history of that statement, and that's not what I meant." And I think my response is like, I don't know that that's better. I don't know that I believe it, and I don't know that it's better. So, it just sounded snappy. Well, whatever. I think, the next part of that is, additional statements by the president saying that, essentially threatening martial law for protesting in the street. So sending in the military and controlling, American citizens who are exercising their freedom of speech and controlling them with the U.S. military. That feels weird. That feels very dangerous. And hopefully, all Americans feel that that's dangerous. I think Senator Tom Cotton wrote an op-ed saying that should happen. That he tweeted out that all these various calling out different military units by name and saying that they should be sent in to the cities and that no quarter should be given, which means that they should kill people, right? That's what no quarter means. They're not allowed to give up. You are just killed. So that feels weird. By sitting senator of the United States, saying that U.S. citizens should be executed in the street for protesting. This is horrible context, and it's really uncomfortable to talk about. But again, that's the context of where we're living right now. I don't think that this is like a partisan thing. Like, I think I rattled off a couple of things by the sitting president and sitting senator who happen to be Republicans. Like, this isn't like a partisan thing. Like, the mayors of Los Angeles and New York, the two largest cities in the country, both got up and supported their police who are exercising brutal tactics in the streets. Like, that's not right. That's not good. The Democratic nominee for president, Joe Biden, was like one of the main supporters of the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, which is like the act which said, like, if you possess like 5 grams of crack cocaine, you get an automatic mandatory minimum of five years in jail. But in order to go to jail for possessing powdered cocaine, you have to possess 500 grams, right? It's like chemically identical, but 500 to 5, 100 to 1 ratio. And of course, like, the population that was, affected by crack cocaine was majority Black, and the population that was using powdered cocaine was majority white. So, this is a critique that crosses party lines. That's the context that your colleagues might or might not be living with.
Yeah, and I think that everybody gets a dose of reality going on around them. They may or may not choose to accept what's happening and want to talk about it, I guess.
Or face it,
yeah.
Right.
And especially if you're someone who doesn't want to face it, you're probably not going to bring it up with somebody else, I would guess.
Right. Yeah.
And that makes it harder.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very easy to avoid as a human being, right? Like, we're masters at avoiding discomfort.
Compartmentalize, right?
Yeah, certainly. But it catches up to you. So, and hopefully what I'm doing is these are like raw topics and very difficult to talk about. And like I said, it's difficult to give all this context without sounding preachy and accusatory. Like, I don't want to sound like that. What I'm trying to do is like be informational. So rather than putting the burden on somebody that to give you all this information and maybe give you the context of thinking about it this way, I can take that on in a one-to-many fashion and say, hey, maybe you could investigate these things, so that you have some of that context. And if you want to engage in a healthy, like, constructive debate about the factual basis for any of these things, like, please feel free to engage with somebody else, not me. Don't slip into my DMs and say, hey, you're wrong about this one thing. Like, that may or may not be true. So I think moving on from context a little bit, onto like the resources that have helped me also a little bit more to intellectualize some of the things and understand some of the feelings that I've had. There was I think Malcolm Gladwell, who's an author that we've mentioned before, has a podcast series called Revisionist History. And he kind of hijacked his own feed to have a reading from a chapter of his book, David and Goliath. And, that book, the theme is exposing why the assumptions that we have about, the underdog, might be wrong. But this specific chapter talked about the British Army's occupation of Northern Ireland, which started in the late 60s. And I think there was a new commander that was sent there, very knowledgeable about use of force and occupation. I think that was like a British specialty for a long period of time, lots of colonies. And so, basically the philosophy on use of force was, in order to stop like protests in the street, we'll just make it very expensive to be a protester. And, the way to make that very expensive is police violence and mass incarceration. And, if we just make it really expensive, then people won't do it. And that actually was the opposite of what happened. It promoted more of it, and it radicalized the population that were subjected to it. But I think it's, if you're not a student of history, it's, it's counterintuitive maybe that, well, it seems logical that if you just do things this way, if you just have overwhelming force, like people will like, just go away. Like, I think that, there's very specific situations, right? Like certainly in like more fascist like countries where, you can like you have like complete control, then and like an active secret police, then maybe you can just, I don't know, kill everybody. Well, I mean, what the Chinese got away with it in Tiananmen Square, right? So they're able to kind of suppress history and do away with all the protests there. Well, okay, so I have this quote here that is uncomfortable to read, but I will read it anyway. And that is, here's the quote. When the students poured into Tiananmen Square, the Chinese government almost blew it. Then they were vicious, they were horrible, they put it down with strength. That shows you the power of strength. And that quote was from Donald Trump in a Playboy interview in 1990. So I think that's what Donald Trump was talking about or had on his mind, or, is in his heart when he talks about, responding to protest. It was like, you dominate the way the Chinese government did. That's a show of strength. I don't know about you. Like, that's not acceptable to me. And that's not like really a political position. That's like a position of me as an American. So, that's yet more context, backing up into context.
I hadn't seen that quote before today, honestly.
Not a reader of Playboy, are you?
No, I am not.
Okay. Maybe that's why you missed it.
I guess.
Just to wrap that up, I think, that whole discussion, it's a great episode to listen to because it removes it from the American context and puts it into the British historical context. And it removes the racial context and adds in like a ethnic and religious, but also like political context, right? It's, part of it, well, you know what? I'll just put a link into the Troubles in Ireland, so you can read all about the, Protestant Catholic, single country versus, British rule context there. But, it's a little bit easier to understand and maybe think about use of force against a population of your own citizens when it's not America, and then maybe learn the lessons that history teaches us, again, outside of the American context. Really, really interesting listen, and it really helped me to contextualize those things. Like, oh, this is why people think that. It's not just, the American leadership that thinks that. It's, people throughout history, and here's, why that can go wrong, right? And then I think kind of the final point here, again, it helped me to understand context. So maybe all of this is going back to context, but really this was my coping, the podcast that helped me cope a little bit. The podcast is called Behind the Bastards. It's done by a guy named Robert Evans, who is a freelance journalist who typically goes into like war zones and does journalism there. But he has this podcast, which is kind of talking about like the worst people in history and giving like more contextual information about them, stuff that we didn't know, um, and maybe exposing some of the worst people in history that we didn't know about. So he did an episode called "The Man Who Teaches Our Cops to Kill," and the description is to discuss this guy named David Grossman, who's the director of the Killology Research Group. I'll just read a little bit more from the description. More than 100 police departments and thousands of police officers have taken Grossman's course over more than 20 years. And they kind of dive into that course. A lot of it is about teaching people to kill more quickly, to recontextualize use of force as something that should be gone to earlier rather than later, and to teach police officers to fear their environment. Coincidentally, being afraid for your life is typically a legitimate a legitimizer for use of lethal force for a police officer. So, it's not as simple as just saying, "Oh, I was afraid for my life," and then you can kill whoever you want. But if you can find other police officers, and testify that yes, like as a police officer, in that situation, it would be completely reasonable to be afraid for your life, then use of force is generally acceptable. Like not that they were actually in danger of their life was in danger, just that it was legitimate to feel fear for their life. And if they're taught by this course to be afraid more often, then implicitly they're being taught to kill more often, right? And actually that is an explicit goal of the course, to kill like earlier, use lethal force faster. We talked about Philando Castile in Minneapolis, who was killed 5 years ago. Like, I think that the police officer who had shot him had recently gone through this course. And it certainly, I think, negatively affected like how much people use the course, but it certainly didn't go away. And it's there's other trainings that are out there that were influenced by this course, and I think okay, we'll put another link. Like there was the Minneapolis, like the mayor of Minneapolis actually banned this training from being used by the Minneapolis PD. But the police union said that that it was so important to their officers that the police union was going to pay for the membership to continue taking it, which is a really weird position to be in, like where the police union is going to override the training directives of the police department leadership. And I think it kind of exposed something, which was that sometimes the police union is way more important to the culture of the police department than the leadership, the elected leadership, and the civilian oversight of the department. Which, I don't know, it made me think one of the things that I need to do is, as an action, is to let my elected officials know that endorsement by the police union is not going to be something that I'm looking for in an elected official. Like, I'm not necessarily going to consider that a negative, but it's certainly not going to. It's not like a default positive, right?
It doesn't tip the scales for you.
No, not anymore. Not if the I don't know that I think unions are great. Right. And I support unions, but I think, again, the unions are there to look out for the membership. And sometimes in police departments, the culture can be looking out for the membership at the expense of the people who are being policed, the citizenry. Right. So protecting people by not testifying if you saw something that was done wrong, and then and ostracizing people if they do testify. Right. If you saw your fellow police officer do something wrong and you testify against them, sometimes the culture of the police force is like, well, you're no longer, welcome here, and you might not be supported, on the field because you didn't support your fellow officers. It's, maybe that attitude. I assume that exists because it's been shaped by television or something. But um, you kind of see this like thin blue line thing, like that's a real thing. You can look that up, and um, I yeah. So it just makes me think that like the police union is not necessarily out for my best interest as a citizen. I don't know if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
It's there for the police officers, not for the citizenry. Not that
Right.
those things come into conflict all the time, but they can. They certainly can.
Right.
I was going to say, if you go back and watch that 5 minutes of police brutality, then maybe that will bring to mind like those two things can come into direct conflict.
Sure.
So, just as a last little piece of explanation, there's something that's come out, a movement called the Defund the Police. And I wanted to, do like a minor explainer about it. I'm not an expert at the movement, but I read and listened to it a little bit, and I wanted to talk about it. Like I don't know that is the right thing to do. Like the gut reaction of people is like, well, if we don't have police, then what would we do? Like, how would we be safe? Who would I call if like somebody's trying to break into my house? And um, I think contextually, I think that's what a lot of African American communities live with every day. Like there's a distrust of the police. The response times to those neighborhoods are so low and so long that it seems almost useless to call the police. Um, so they don't look upon calling the police as a source of safety, right? And again, if you are living in fear of the police and you see, constant, people that look like you being killed by police officers, then, maybe you have a legitimate reason to not call them. Right. So that is the world that many people live in today. So it is kind of a call to like maybe start over. What are the functions that the police are serving? How do we serve those functions outside of the organization that we currently call the police, right? Should there be detectives investigating, violent crimes and murders and white collar crime? Yes, probably. Is it inside the context of what we currently call the police department? People who believe in this movement don't think so. They think that those functions can be done, in a separate organization. Um, we currently have we call out the police, to deal with homeless people, instead of funding programs to deal with homelessness. So maybe instead of funding the police to handle a homeless issue, we should fund social services to handle that issue. I think that's kind of the discussion in a nutshell, and we can link to some additional resources. Again, it's not necessarily something that I'm advocating, but hopefully you can understand if the call is for police reform. Like imagine that you're a black resident of Minneapolis, and you've seen this happen 5 years ago. You know, police kill somebody. There's protests in the streets, calls for reform, a reform process, and then 5 years later, it all happens again. Um, calls for reform start to fall on deaf ears. Like, well, that doesn't work. And like, how do we get to 2020? And then we need to start with like, well, why don't we just reform the police force? Like that starts to, and I think has like fallen on deaf ears for a while. Like, okay, well, I don't know what you think reform is, and I don't know what form that's going to take. But results speak for themselves, and the results are people are being killed on the streets. So that was a really difficult conversation.
Yeah, it definitely was. And I'm sure it was even harder because you had to lead it. And I just want to say I don't think our intent here is not to have some kind of weird secret agenda. But as John said, more to try and give you context of what the people that you interact with at work, home, etc., are going through and what's happening to them. And hopefully it gives you some lens of maybe a little bit of understanding. Obviously, you're not in their shoes and you can't completely understand everything, but I think supporting those folks, letting them know that they can talk to you if needed, just like you said in the dues section above, is important. And I don't know that everybody has to agree on every single debate out there, but I think it's important that we can talk to each other about it
Yeah, absolutely.
and try and understand where each person in the conversation is coming from without being quick to make assumptions.
Right.
That's what I got out of it, John, honestly.
Hmm.
Because when we started, just like I said, I didn't know I didn't know how to talk to you about it,
Sure,
honestly.
sure.
And I think I'm still gonna struggle with that, even though we're good friends.
Hmm.
Because, like I said, I don't want to pick the scab.
No, I totally get it. It's difficult. It's difficult to offer emotional support too. Like that is, especially at a time when we're all under emotional stress, to like take on the role of providing emotional support for somebody else is very, very difficult. You know, um, and but if we're not here for each other, then what are we doing, right?
Right. I think my boss said it the other day that everybody's emotional cup is like 75% full as soon as you wake up right now.
Yeah, yeah.
So the
Tough
littlest
times.
thing just puts you over the more than you can bear line.
Yeah. It was a small thing for me. Like I went to drop off a package at the UPS store, and like as I like pulled up and they were like boarding up the windows, right? I don't know why that like pushed me over the edge, but I came back and I was so grumpy. Like I was like, what is going on in this world that, you know, brings people to the point of needing to express their frustration to this degree, that
Yeah.
the business owners are fearful of their businesses, which is, I mean, that's totally legit, but, why do, you know, why have we driven people to this level of frustration?
Yeah.
Anyway, tough discussion. I hope that it was easier to listen to than it was for us to record. um, and
No kidding.
I hope it didn't come off as preachy. I hope it came off as, me, Nick and I, offering up, this context in a way to offer support in rather than having to interrogate people that maybe don't have the wherewithal to be interrogated about this right now.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'll say is it didn't sound in any way like those times you got in this on the soapbox in episode 9, for example. One of my favorite moments, by the way. That was just a little jib to make you smile. But one thing I will say is John is one of the most inclusive dudes I know, and it seems like every time I talk to him about something, he shows me a different way of thinking about something, and that he's very capable of seeing something from another person's perspective. And I know that as you presented these things, it wasn't an attempt to like sway one person this way or that. It was just, here's the information that's out there. You can educate yourself. So
Right.
just, if you're listening, just know that.
Yeah. Maybe that's a fault. I maybe I over intellectualize even like other people and their problematic attitudes when I shouldn't give them a chance. But you know, it is the way that I am. So I hope that's not too much of a problem. But
No.
I think it's maybe time for us to get out of here. And again, thanks to all of the listeners for listening to me and to Nick. And I hope that you are in a good place emotionally, and I hope that you're getting the support that you need. And hopefully we can circle back and get back to our regularly scheduled discussions about career.
There you go. Just a reminder, we want people to subscribe and give us a positive review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you're listening. We want to know if we're being helpful and are always looking for interesting questions to ponder. We're collectively on Twitter at Nerd Journey, and I just want to say that the things we talked about definitely are going to affect your career and the conversations you have, so keep that in mind.
Awesome. Farewell, listeners. Tune in next time as the journey continues. I'm John White at VJourneyman, for Nick Cordy at Network Nerd _ signing off.